Okay, we're back with another one for today. A very rainy day. You know, this weather, we can't catch a break out here. It's snowing, then it's raining, then it's going to snow again. So cool. Stuck inside for a lot. This one's actually from a recommendation from Nividius or Nivideus or something, who recommended that I look at the debate portion of this great debate from the ASSC. So I should have checked this out. When this is from a couple of years ago, last year, 2023. ASSC, of course, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. We just had a big conference here in New York City, which I helped put together in some small way. I was on the scientific organizing committee. I've been a part of the ASSC for a long time, been to many of its meetings. Only one of them, though, have I actually been to outside of the U.S., although someone once described those as the more important meetings. I rarely get to go to them, unfortunately. So this was a debate amongst protagonists of some of our main big ideas about consciousness that we currently have. So we have IIT, it looks like Melanie Bali. We have recurrent processing theory, Victor Lama, Stanislaw Dehaene, global neuronal workspace theory, and then Steve Fleming's defending the higher order thought theory. It looks like, okay. I knew that this was happening. I talked to Steve about this. I know a lot of these people. I know the guy whose channel this is on, for example, Johannes Farnfort. I'm working with some of these guys on other projects, trying to test some of these ideas. So I very much agree that these are some of our big ideas that we have right now, and what we want are ways to differentiate amongst them. So it will be interesting to see what is going on here. So I'm not going to listen to every presentation, although maybe that would be interesting for a different day. I want to start with the discussion, so we'll jump right to it, because I think that's what someone, Nivideus or whatever, was trying to ask.
I need to find the best way to learn math and science.
It's brilliant.org.
Whoa.
Brilliant.
And now there's more work in progress. We're also working actively not only to try to explain extending of space, but why time feels like flowing, and object and colors and sound are different from one another.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I don't know if you can hear me.
Welcome everyone to the second part of the session. We are glad, Liad and I, that you decided to come back.
So let's see. So this is Steve Fleming. That's Victor Lama. That looks like Stan Dehaene. Maybe that's Melanie Bali over here. And then right here is Liad Mudrik and Lucia Maloney, who I think are chairing it. Yeah, it says right here they're chairing it. Okay, cool.
And the first part, as you heard, was try to establish some consensus. And the reason for that was because there is some of the arguments that we made are not necessarily trivial. So Victor just brought up, like, consciousness is in the brain. Why? So, and now we need to understand, like, what do we mean that consciousness is in the brain and how? And so we hope that the next session now is to try and understand not only what do we agree on, but what are the...
Wait, where did Victor bring that up? Consciousness in the brain? Maybe the question is, why not in the toe or something? I don't know what they're talking about right there.
Aspects that we disagree on. And again, like you said, part of the last session was that we also understood that not every theory makes the same predictions as to when, for instance, we would expect to have consciousness in babies, for instance, right? And we all know that understanding consciousness has ethical consequences. And these theories actually make different predictions. So what we want to do now is to map out a little bit those, to try also to derive consequences as to what that means.
Right, so
we're going to end up...
Sorry, this is something I actually talked to, excuse me, something I actually talked to people about on Consciousness Live, these different predictions about infants, for example, with Claudia Passos, who is interested in this topic and taking theories of consciousness and asking questions about what do they say about infant consciousness. So the theories do make differing predictions with respect to that. So I guess what the point here is that there are real life implications for theories of consciousness. It's not just abstract theoretical debates.
At 7:30 as planned, even though we started later because we were just told. You want to start?
Yeah. So we're going to start with a beautiful question. As you know, as I said at the beginning, people have been sending us questions, and a beautiful question that was sent to us from India, from Ramya Mudamba. I don't know if here you are. Thank you. So Ramya was asking, what's the strongest and most promising criticism of your own theory that you need to address, in your opinion? So it's...
The most promising and strongest objection to your own theory. Oh, this is going to be for each person to answer? Oh, fun.
It's a tough one and a good one.
Strong as what?
So what is the strongest and most promising criticism of your own theory that you think you need to address? So where did you start?
Oh.
Okay. You're up, Victor. Go.
It's a tough one.
Well, a few issues come to mind, but the obvious one, of course, would be to somehow convince people that if they suffer inattentional blindness or change blindness, that they actually see this stuff. And of course, that's very difficult to.
So first of all, in case you don't know, Victor Lama defends the recurrent processing theory of consciousness, whereby he thinks that, like for example, with visual consciousness, that it could occur because of recurrent processing feedback to areas that are in the visual cortex, not necessarily V1, but let's say V3, V4. So that once there's this kind of feedback to those areas from higher areas, then consciousness could result in that relatively confined part of the brain. So he's saying the strongest objection to his view would be to convince people that they actually see those things in inattentional blindness. So wait, would that be support for his theory or is an objection to his theory? Let me hear this again.
Oh.
It's a tough one.
Well, a few issues come to mind, but the obvious one, of course, would be to somehow convince people that if they suffer inattentional blindness or change blindness, that they actually see this stuff. And of course, that's very difficult that's a fairly obvious critique of these local theories, and that's of course a difficult one to address. So, and you actually need.
Oh, I see. Okay. So what he's saying, I think, is that according to his own theory, you could have like a phenomenally conscious experience of something that you didn't know you saw. So take the inattentional blindness case. Change blindness and inattentional blindness are technically slightly different, but they're related, one might think. So here you are looking at something. The classic case is they're passing a basketball between people wearing a certain color shirt, for example. So you are in this experiment and they tell you, count the number of times that the people in white pass the basketball. You go, okay. So there's people in white and people in black also, and they're passing the basketball and you're counting how many times it goes from the player to player. Oh, that's not the white one. Okay, there, he's wearing a white jersey. Okay, so forth, so on. Now, while that happens, something unusual happens. In the classic case, is the gorilla comes out and does that. They have variations on this, but something that you wouldn't expect would happen, and people don't notice. Some people do, obviously. They say, what the? Other people just count the basketballs, and then afterwards they go, huh, and then show the video again, and they're quite surprised. So in a different case, you might be showing two pictures, one where there's an apple in the center and one where there isn't, and the apple's there, then not there, then not there, not, etc. And you might be looking at the picture, which has some other fruit and maybe, tables, and not notice that the apple is missing in one or that it's there in the other. You might just not. Okay, some people say, is there anything changing here? I say, I don't know. So that's change blindness, inattentional blindness. So on Victor's view, when you're looking around at the picture and the apple is like blinking in and out, he thinks you see the apple and you experience the apple. It's just you're not aware of it. You don't know it. So I think what he's saying is that the most pressing objection to his view is like that we don't actually experience or consciously see these things when we don't notice them, and that his job is to convince people that we do in fact have this kind of conscious experience when we deny it. And in fact, some of the experiments that I've been involved with trying to help set up to test versions of Victor's theory against like higher order theories, for example, involve just this idea of trying to figure out what would count as maybe not a knockdown argument, but at least good enough that it would suggest strongly enough that there was something which was consciously experienced, and yet the subject was unaware of their experiencing it. It's hard to find such a really knockdown, clear-cut case, and that's, I think, what he's talking about here.
Arguments outside of this experiment, and you these local theories.
Hold on, let me go back.
This stuff, and of course that's very difficult to. That's a fairly obvious critique of these local theories, and that's of course a difficult one to address. So, and you actually need arguments outside of this experiment itself, aside from the iconic and fragile memory experiments. But you need, I think, you need arguments outside of that experiment itself.
So the iconic memory having to do with Sperling, and this idea that for a brief moment we have this kind of very detailed visual representation that gets lost or overwritten. And then fragile memory is this thing which Victor's lab has been discovering and developing, which is supposed to be this kind of in-between state of the iconic memory and it being sent into working memory or something like that. This kind of really detailed representation, which is fragile in the sense that it's overwritten by any new information coming in, but it's extremely detailed. Longer lasting than iconic memory. So therefore they call it by a different name, visual short-term fragile memory. I forget the exact whatever. But anyway, so that's what he's talking about, these experimental paradigms. So what he's saying is we need arguments that go from, you can't just use the experiments as a way to convince people of this. And I kind of think he's right, because there's always two interpretations of these experimental setups, especially the ones that we're able to do now.
Arguments outside of this experiment itself, aside from the iconic and fragile memory experiments, but you need, I think you need arguments outside of that experiment itself to convince people that indeed they have a conscious experience of what they don't know having.
So let me press.
That's a tough one, I would say. Yeah.
Let me press you on that, because you also said in your talk, and I thought it was very revealing, that at some point it seems as if the discussion ends at definitions. So you say it's conscious, someone else says, no, it's not conscious because you don't have access. How do we resolve that? Like, is there any means by which you can persuade me that this is indeed conscious?
Yeah, well then, as I said, then you have to look at what other aspects of consciousness a particular theory is explaining or is not explaining, and then at the end, as I said, the recurrency is explaining the unity, integration, stuff like that, or at least it's I think doing a fair job in that.
Well, now hold on. Let's just stop here for a second, because first of all, I think it's unfair to ask for how would you convince me. So, what we want to do is present the case, the evidence, and then let the people make up their own minds. But it is an important question, because it does seem at a certain point that you come down to basically that there are two models of these sorts of experimental results. One of which has these very rich conscious experiences, which we can only select out some parts of, but the rest is there, sort of like a picture, like a photograph, like off screen, waiting for you to examine it. Like if you were literally holding the photograph in your hand and you zoom in on one part of it, the rest of the photograph is still there. Whereas the other side views these things as much more like, I guess a computer would be a good metaphor, that there is a kind of, the information for the conscious experience is there, like when you're storing images on your laptop, there's a bunch of zeros and ones that code information about what part of the screen to light up. But suppose you open up a photo and you're looking at it on your phone or whatever, and you zoom in on a part. Well, the other part of the photo is not there waiting for you to go and look at it like a photograph in your hand. Rather, it's just a bunch of zeros and ones. It's unconscious, in other words, and waiting to be rendered on the screen of your experience. So those are two different interpretations. One, that there's these rich unconscious states, which then when we pay attention or do something, enter into consciousness. The other is that they're conscious already, and we sort of select out some subset of them. So all of these experiments can be interpreted in either way. And the question was, well, how could you convince someone who had a different interpretation what the right answer was? And part of what he's saying is that, well, you got to look at the theories and take them on their merits as they relate to a bunch of other stuff. Like he said, recurrent processing explains like maybe integration and stuff like that, unity. Okay. But it's not really, to be 100% honest and fair, we don't really know what recurrent processing is doing. And some people want to interpret that recurrent processing as doing something else. And in fact, maybe Steve will talk about this because he has a view where the activity related to global broadcast and recurrent processing are actually doing something other than what these people think that they're doing. And it's not clear how to address that. However, okay, so I don't think he just gets to assume oh, I just heard a beep in my ear. Oh, I see. People are... Okay, so I lost my train of thought there for a second, so let's get back to this. Let him finish his story. Well, I guess I was saying, oh yeah, so I was confused at two things. So one, Steve has a story about global ignition activity being related to maybe backpropagation or error correcting, something like that. And other higher theorists have interpretation of recurrent processing as maybe involving, some kind of forming of a single state between a higher order and a lower order state. So now I'm not saying either of those things are right. What I'm saying is we don't really know what recurrent processing is doing. We don't really know what feedback from higher areas, what that signifies at the neural level. We have ideas about it. So in a sense, Victor's view is just that there's a kind of neural signature associated with consciousness. And so he would very much need some other way of trying to convince us that these things are related to consciousness, whether in these experimental cases or otherwise.
And then on the basis of that explanatory power that the theory has, try to convince people that you may at some point override this even the first person perspective that they may have. So I think one of the reasons why we still stuck in this.
Wait, hold on, I missed what he said because I was
doing a fair job in that.
Let me go back.
Brought up like conscious is in the brain.
Oh, sorry, that's too far.
I feel like we're just losing traction.
Dang.
Because I
Recurrency is explaining the unity, integration, stuff like that, or at least it's I think doing a fair job in that. And then on the basis of that explanatory power that the theory has, try to convince people that you may at some point override this even the first person perspective that they may have. So I think one of the reasons.
Oh, I see. So he's saying that if you can show that this theory does so well in these other cases, then we'll kind of trust it, and then we'll say, gee, okay, so maybe we really do have consciousness, even when we're in no way aware of it. I don't know. For me personally, when I first started all this, I thought it was kind of obvious that there could be experience that you weren't aware of. And then I started thinking about it, and I was like, what does that even mean? That it's like when there's experience or something that it's like for me. So if I'm not aware of it in any way, then how is it like something for me? Yeah, okay, so maybe you can get around that, but it starts to seem very strange. Then I thought, well, maybe it's like almost contradictory to say there's experience that isn't something that you're aware of. But also, it doesn't seem contradictory to say that there's a table over to my left has this color property even when I'm not looking at it, even if that's not the way it is, who knows, etc. So I don't know. I think these things are all very confusing when we start to think about, could there be experience of which the person whose experience it was completely denied having it. So Victor's idea is that you could have this visual experience. It could be like a regular visual experience, like it could be like seeing red and blue and all the other stuff, but you could just, and it's not, you could just not notice it or be aware of it, but it's still like phenomenally conscious in all its glory. And some people go, well, what does that even mean? There's some state there, but why think it's got phenomenal consciousness? Now, maybe you just think that every mental state is phenomenally conscious, but other than that, what reason is there for thinking that? And I think what he's saying here is that maybe we take first personal evidence too seriously in this case. That's about what he's going to say. Maybe let's.
That's why we still stuck in this. Well, these kinds of debates is that
it's fun.
Is that we are so strongly believing in this folk psychology and first person perspective notion of consciousness that we forget that sometimes science may tell us differently. This happens quite often in physics, and then it's sort of taken for granted. But somehow in psychology, and particularly when it comes to consciousness and neuroscience also, we have so much trouble into letting really the science convince us that maybe our introspection and maybe...
Yeah, but how would the science convince us of this? Because I see this more as like a question of like the overall explanatory mesh, like how you fit all the pieces together between neuroscience, psychology, and introspection, and then what gives you the overall best account of all that kind of stuff. And then those things that overall best account should then make further predictions, which would help you narrow it down or qualify things in various ways. So it sounds like he is admitting, though, that the idea that there's conscious experience which you don't know about or that you're unaware of is extremely counterintuitive, and we would need to overthrow common sense or folk psychology. So I don't really like these kinds of arguments. I do think, as I've said many times, that a kind of weak illusionism has to be true, right? I don't think that there is a theory of consciousness which can account for all the things that we think are true just at face value. So once you start doing science learning about the brain, I think that something's got to give in some sense. Everyone's got to accept that consciousness is slightly other than it appears to be. But I don't know if that means giving up this first person stuff. So I think that it would require some pretty serious evidence to overrule first person stuff. And, lots of people find this idea that phenomenal consciousness exists without you being aware of it very intuitive. So I don't know if he, anyway, I think it's interesting the way he's trying to defend his view here. But
folk psychology is wrong.
But let me press on that because I'm sorry.
No.
Go ahead. No, go.
But I feel like there's a big difference between consciousness science and, say, quantum physics, because quantum physics might tell us something counterintuitive about reality. Mm-hmm. But if consciousness science ends up in a place that totally divorces from the folk psychological notion of what we're trying to explain, then I think it's not going to, in a sense, count as an explanation of the phenomenon. So in your case, if you have someone who's denying awareness of that mental state, and yet your theory says, no, they are conscious, then I feel like we're just losing traction on the original phenomenon we started with.
Interesting. All right, so that's obviously Steve, as I mentioned already, but so there are those who think that we need to keep as close to folk psychology as we can. And I agree, we start off, this is, we're not going to become eliminativists because we start off wanting to study consciousness, and then the end result can't be that, the thing we started out to study wasn't there. But it's complicated because sometimes that does happen, etc. But it doesn't seem that way in this case. But anyway, so I sort of get what Steve is saying here, that we have to have some link back to the common sense notion to count as giving an explanation of that thing. I still think it's you got to walk a tight line between paying respect to the folk psychology and recognizing that science overturns our intuitive judgments all the time.
Well, of course, there's a difference between totally divorcing from, from in this case, folk psychology, or adjusting folk psychology a bit. And by the way,
Yeah.
of course, if you would ask a person on the street, okay, what does visual perception look like? I think very little people would say, well, it's very limited to the few things we attend to. Most people, I think, would say, well, we have this rich visual percept. It's only these damn psychologists who tell them, no, you have these change blindness experiments, and here I have inattentional blindness experiments telling you, no, it's
them,
different.
not all of them.
Yeah, okay. No, but so in that sense, I think actually local theories are close.
Yeah, so that's why I said I was surprised at the way he was trying to defend his view, because I was like, he's already admitting that this is kind of counterintuitive, whereas like it's not clear that it is. Okay, so he's
to our real folk psychology, and maybe are divorcing from academic psychology.
But
yeah, so this is why I don't really think these debates about the folk psychology really carry that much weight. So I agree that we want a starting place. So for example, this debate about whether you could have experience that you don't know about. Many people, like Steve was hinting at, start from the fact that, gee, I have there's a folk psychological platitude, some people call it transitivity principle or something, that says that if a state's there but you're not aware of it, then it's not conscious. And you can evoke that intuition from people. But there's also other intuitions, as I was saying. It's not clear that these folk psychological platitudes, or what intuitions ordinary persons have before they get to do the science, are going to really be useful here. They can be starting points, but I don't think they can be final arbiters. That's why I was thinking, okay, so what we really want is to see how the theories overall sit with the data we have, and then what predictions they make from there, which would differentiate them. And then we can start talking about these things. I don't even think we're at that point yet, because I was just saying we don't know what recurrent processing is doing. We don't know how these theories are implemented in the brain. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about this. It just means we should take it all with a grain of salt.
Let me just, because I want to push you on the starting point, right? So what I seem to have understood from your answer also is that your starting point is data in some sense, right? Whereas I think that for IIT, the IIT is extremely clear as to the starting point is phenomenology. So now from there, you go to the...
Well, you can't have the starting point be data, because you have to start with what the subjects are saying they see or don't see, which I guess is data in a sense. They say they see this or don't see this. But it's... what does she mean? He starts with data. The data, like an intentional blindness and change blindness, is that people say they don't see it, but then behave in certain ways that indicate that there's some information there. Then you interpret that in various ways. So how do you start with the data? I mean, I see what she's trying to contrast here. I'm not trying to object too strongly, because I think the contrast that's trying to be made here is that he thinks of himself as trying to interpret an experiment, and IIT people think of themselves as starting from experience and deducing mathematical axioms about how it must be implemented. So that is a difference.
Physical and blah, blah, right? But whereas you're trying to do the opposite. You're saying, like, whatever I experience, I am pretty wrong. And as I get more data, I will understand why I'm wrong.
No, it's a two-way street. You have data, you have intuitions, you have folk psychology, you have all these things coming together, and then of course you also have neuroscience. I mean, what I also don't like about much of consciousness research is that neuroscience is always treated as the slave of psychology, in the sense that we have to fit neuroscience into whatever psychological concepts that we've came up with. I think neuroscience should be on equal footing with the psychological insights that we have and the intuitive insights that we have, and that combining all this, combining neuroscience, psychology.
Yeah, but what does that mean? So the reason why psychology is often thought to be, I wouldn't put it the way he did, but the superior one, not superior even, but anyway, it's because to interpret what's going on in the brain, all these neurons, requires a theory of how it relates to the psychology. So you can't just start by looking at the brain and saying really anything meaningful without having a theory, interpreting what you're looking at, or even what parts of what you're looking at are relevant. So I sort of get what he's saying. Like, neuroscience is important, and it can change our insights in what we think of at the psychological level. But you're not going to have a neuroscientific theory of consciousness. I just don't think it's going to happen, because consciousness is a psychological level phenomenon. So we want a theory of it at that level, and then an implementation of it in the brain.
Neuroscience, folk psychology, introspection, third person perspectives. We have to find a theory which makes most sense. Most chocolate, we say in Dutch. most sense of all this combined, and only then, yeah, I think we can approach the truth. And if we keep introspection, for example, as the gold standard that we always have to stick to, yeah, well, I think history has proven that we don't go anywhere then.
If I may also enter the debate, I think introspection is really what we have to explain, and that's it in the field. I was very struck when you, in your presentation...
So Stan thinks all there is to explain is the introspection. The science of consciousness is just in the business of explaining how it is that we come up with these kinds of judgments. So interesting. Let's continue.
You make one statement that made me jump, and but I think it's exactly the one that you yourself pointed as a difficulty. You said, as recurrence in posterior areas is independent of attention, it is a good candidate for consciousness. And I thought, no, it's exactly a bad candidate for consciousness precisely for that reason. I realized that perhaps you don't take very seriously experiments of inattention. Like, I was very influenced personally by Irving Rock and the Inattentional Blindness book, where, just after a big flash, if you are not attending, you don't see it in many cases. But of course, there is the attentional blink or PRP phenomenon where people literally don't see. And it's very hard to contest that they don't see. They have no memories and so on.
Okay, hold on. So this is exactly what he was contesting just a second ago, that they don't see. But the Rock one is an interesting case, because they've been doing some work on this, trying to replicate this. Some of these older change blindness studies that have kind of fallen aside. So what they did there is really cool. They did eye tracking. So whenever they show the picture, and whenever the person would move their eyes, they would change something. And in one case, there was a person holding a bird up, like a little kid with his arm extended, and the bird was really close to the camera, like right in their visual field. And they would switch the bird from red to green. So the person's eyes moved away, and they make the change. They're tracking the eye, so they know the person's not looking there. But after that, they track the eye, so they know the person's eyes go back. So they can show with the eye tracker that the person's eyes went to the red parrot, then went away, and then came back to the green parrot. And then the people say, some people notice, but then people say afterwards, you ask them, did you see anything? They say, what? No. And you say, did you notice the bird change from red to green? They go, what? So that's very striking, because, you're not manipulating their attention. That's why they don't call it inattentional blindness. But that's, just a case where there's a big change that happens just a fraction of a second while you're, that's literally how quick it takes, like even quicker. So people say they don't see it. We have evidence that their eyes were pointed at it. So the light was going into their eye. So what do you say about such a case? And that's exactly the question. Do you say that the person experienced the change but just didn't know it? That they had an experience of the red and the green? Or whichever way I said? Or do you say what Stan's trying to say, that we have no reason to think that that they really saw it because they weren't attending to it? It wasn't something that they, that this is a good way of framing the difference between them, because Victor thinks, the very fact that it's outside of attention is good evidence that it could be a candidate for consciousness, where Stan is arguing that no, that what would that even mean? it's very precisely the fact that something's associated with attention in these processes that make it a good candidate for being involved in consciousness, like the global workspace theory, I guess. So that's interesting. But I think, so anyway, I sorry to interrupt that, but I think that Victor's about to respond by saying, no, I think we did see it.
Of course, there are fairly reasonable alternative accounts for that, which is that it's not so much a lack of phenomenology, but a lack of access, a lack of attention, a lack of memory also often, particularly in the case of inattentional blindness and change blindness. That's clearly been shown that that's mostly a matter of, it actually should be called not change blindness, but change failure of memory. Same with inattentional blindness. There are easy ways of explaining this. By noticing that it's not a matter of an absence of phenomenology, but more an absence of other cognitive functions, and other cognitive functions indeed like attention.
So in the famous gorilla experiment, you think they see the gorilla?
Well, you could argue whether there is a phenomenology of a gorilla in the sense of, is it, what's the phenomenology of...
Yeah, so is it of a gorilla or something, a black shape?
Gorilla, of course, it's a black thing which moves about, and then at a somewhat higher level, there's also this notion that it's an animal, and then that it's maybe a dangerous animal. So there's all these different levels of the phenomenology, but in the essence, that there is a black thing moving around there. I would say, yeah.
They see it.
Well, that they have a phenomenal experience of that, but of course it's...
that's the seeing, right? Is it not the knowing, that you, as you put it. So that they see it.
Yeah.
So they have a phenomenal experience.
Yeah. But still, you would have to predict that the loops stop early on, right? Because you're willing to say it's a black figure, but you're not willing to say it's a gorilla. So would you say that the activation stops?
Of course.
So the loop stops. So what he's trying to say is that the recurrent processing is going to loop back to the area to light it up, so to speak, before it gets to the semantic information of being animal or gorilla. But he's going to say, no, it's going spiraling out. I still think they're not really addressing this claim. I wonder if Steve's going to bring it up, that there are different ways of interpreting what the RPC signal is doing, or in other words, what this recurrent processing really indicates. So just saying that there's this processing there and that it's associated with consciousness doesn't all by itself tell us whether it's a first order or a higher order account of consciousness, or even an IIT one or anything, unless you make certain anatomical assumptions, like that this area is associated with vision, so therefore this is where visual consciousness is. Otherwise, you just get that there's a certain sort of neural activity, and that this neural activity is associated with people performing certain things and various tasks. But okay, back to the thing.
This depends on what the representation of a gorilla exactly is.
By the way, this is all because of the first question, like what's the best objection to your theory, and they picked on poor Victor and didn't ask anybody else what's the best objection. But he's right. This is the best. So he's being honest. At least the best objection to his theory is that you have to convince us of these strange interpretations of these results.
Of course, we as humans have quite an elaborate representation of the thing we attach.
You know what? I take that back. I would say the best objection to his theory is that we don't know that this stuff is really a first order stuff, what it's associated with psychologically. So we can't really say what his theory of consciousness is.
Gorilla. So would you say that the activation stops?
Of course. This depends on what the representation of a gorilla exactly is. Of course, we as humans have quite an elaborate representation of the thing we attach the word gorilla to. But amongst things, it's a black moving thing and an animal. Of course, we have these animal neurons in our head, so these are probably getting activated. We have, of course, face-selective neurons, which are probably getting activated by this black thing we have, because it usually has a face. And so all that visual stuff is going on. But of course, for us, the notion of a gorilla also comes with, it lives in either a zoo or in the wilderness, but and it may be dangerous, which are sort of extra additional connotations we have with this visual object. But the visual object representation itself yeah, I would say is fully there.
But then what empirical tests do you have in order to differentiate between unconscious processing of the gorilla and seeing without knowing?
So that's what that's what I thought they were talking about this whole time, is that's what he, it's hard in front of an audience, they're just having a discussion, but I thought that was his point this entire time, was that this is the biggest objection to his view, and it's hard to know what would count as an evidence against, or for or against the idea that there's this unconscious experience without you knowing about it. And he thinks that you have to go beyond these kinds of experiments to talk about how this idea has explanatory power in other places. And if you were convinced enough by that, then you would come back here and say, okay, so I guess there is this conscious experience without me knowing about it. But that is not going to be like an experiment, which he thinks is going to prove it. So that's what I think his response to this question is. He's going to be said, that's what I've been saying. My own view is, this is difficult, so that, that there are these two competing interpretations of this broad set of data that we already have. And that we want to look at those overarching frameworks and what kind of predictions they individually make. Like, for example, that's why I'm working on this experiment with Victor, to try to say, look, even if you give him these assumptions, this isn't going to work. So in particular, in the change blindness kinds of cases that he's interested in, where he wants to rule out that working memory is involved or any sort of attention is involved, even in those sorts of cases, I still think there's a good chance that you experienced the thing that you said that you didn't notice. Seems commonsensical to me. So we should be able to find some evidence for that that's not in the place that he says. Now, of course, if you don't find that evidence there, does that refute the entire higher order approach? No, it refutes a particular version of it. But, or at least, puts pressure on it, because our data is not good enough to really refute anything at this point, I'd say. But I'm all for this. So anyway, I should shut up now and let him talk, since I'm here to listen.
The gorilla without knowing.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point I made in the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
You can only convince people of that difference by...
They're already convinced.
Dirty pool. She said you can only convince them if they're already convinced. In a way, that's sort of true. Some people think you can't ever resolve this issue empirically. Some people think it's not even really a meaningful issue. It is difficult. I can see reasons for being skeptical.
Convinced.
No. By alluding to the other benefits that come with this view, and those other benefits are, as I tried to explain, that the recurrency itself is sufficient to explain, things like unity and.
But that's what I don't understand. Let me.
In that sense, it's the same as with quantum physics. I mean, quantum physics is hugely counterintuitive, but with quantum physics, we can, or at least physicists. I'm not a physicist, so I'm probably talking nonsense here. But with quantum physics,
why do they always bring quantum physics in? They don't know what they're talking about, and no one. This isn't good for the debate.
We are better able to understand the universe, and it should be the same with the consciousness or with psychology in general. We should try to find theories which are better able to make sense of this whole set of, as I said, neuroscience, psychology, folk psychology, intuition, etc. And then indeed the consequence would be that we should say to people, well, at least we should be able to convince people that they have a phenomenal experience of such a gorilla.
But let me press you there, because I think that here's where there is the real divide in some sense, right? And it's more than terms, I would say.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so we've been going on this for a while. Let's go ahead and pause it here. I'll come back to this in a part 2.